Zita of Bourbon-Parma was born into royalty, but not into power, not yet. Because in the world she was born into, power didn't belong to women, especially not to quiet, watchful girls who held their secrets behind tightly laced corsets and ironed gloves. Her name was whispered, not shouted, and that's exactly how she survived. She only needed silence and patience, and when the right moment came, she didn't strike. She erased. If stories like these keep you watching, don't forget to subscribe now. This is where royalty bleeds, and legends are rewritten. Stay with us till the end, because what Zita did from the shadows will haunt the crowns of Europe forever. They had wealth, sure. They had manners, but they had no future. She was born in 1892, in a crumbling palace on the Italian border, into a family that was royal by name, but fading by influence. The House of Bourbon-Parma had once ruled duchies and commanded armies, but by the time Zita was a child, their power had dwindled to ceremonial titles and polite irrelevance. But Zita watched. She learned. And Zita could see it. She was the 17th of 24 children. 24. Think about that. Imagine growing up in a house where attention was rare and affection was political, where your siblings were rivals before they were companions, where your mother didn't have time to love you, and your father didn't have the power to protect you. The loudest people in the room were almost never the ones in control. While others played piano or posed for portraits, she listened to the adults speak when they thought she couldn't understand. She read books she wasn't supposed to read, and she realized something early on. At finishing school in the convent, the nuns taught her to stitch, to bow, to be humble. But Zita was learning something else, something they didn't see, because disappearing was a weapon. If they didn't see you coming, they couldn't stop you. By the time she was 17, Zita spoke 5 languages fluently. She could quote Latin texts. She could walk into a ballroom and vanish into the corner without ever being forgotten. She didn't dazzle. She haunted. She was learning how to disappear. And that sips when Austria noticed her. The future emperor, not the country. Archduke Karl of Austria was a man raised with more responsibility than freedom. He was stiff, proper, bred for duty. He'd been promised to others. But then he saw Zita at a family gathering in Switzerland, and something shifted. And that made her unforgettable. She didn't flirt. She didn't chase. She didn't even seem interested. Karl was supposed to marry for politics, but he proposed to Zita, quietly, stubbornly, and against every whisper in the Habsburg court. She accepted. And suddenly the girl who'd grown up in the shadows was walking straight into the lion's den. Because Zita knew what this world was, but she had been trained by survival to outlast. She had not been raised to rule. And the empire she had just married into? It was already cracking. Austria-Hungary was a decaying giant. Dozens of ethnic groups, bound by paper treaties and dynastic lies. The Emperor Franz Joseph was ancient. The archdukes were arrogant. The military was outdated. The people were restless. And worse, the war drums had started. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Karl's uncle, was assassinated in Sarajevo. The world shifted. The old rules broke. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia responded. Then Germany. Then France. Then Britain. Zita watched the world unravel from inside a palace that smelled of smoke. And then it happened. Franz Joseph died. Karl became emperor, and Zita, empress. She was 24, a Catholic woman in the heart of a fractured multi-faith empire, a foreigner to half her subjects, a mother to 4 children under the age of 5, and now the symbolic face of a dying monarchy in the middle of the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. But she did not break. While bombs fell and borders burned, Zita stepped deeper into the war room. She didn't just host charities and kiss soldiers in hospitals. She read classified reports. She advised on negotiations. She wrote secret letters to France, without Karl's ministers knowing. but not with the generals in charge. Because peace, she believed, was possible. She tried to broker a separate peace. In 1917, she reached out through her brother, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who served in the Belgian army. She proposed secret talks with France and Britain. They called it the Sixtus Affair, not with men who thought war was a game of maps and medals. And when it leaked, the court turned on her. But what they didn't say is that she was right. They accused her of betrayal, of treason, of weakening Austria's military stance, of undermining her husband. They said she was a meddling woman, a foreign spy, a Catholic radical. But history, as always, favored blood over wisdom. Austria was losing the war, and Zita had tried to stop it. Austria-Hungary collapsed. Zita was forced into exile, pregnant with her 8th child. Karl abdicated. But exile is where Zita became dangerous, because now she had no court to please, no throne to defend, only a name and a memory. Exile did not break her. In the cold wind of Switzerland, far from the war-torn palaces of Vienna and Budapest, Zita of Bourbon-Parma sat by a cracked window pane, holding her newborn child in her arms. Around her, children whispered. Her husband, the former Emperor Karl, paced silently. Outside, strangers passed without bowing. It forged her. It was 1919. The empire was gone. But Zita had not surrendered. They had stolen her crown, yes, but not her fire. And in exile, that fire became something far more dangerous: memory. Zita understood what others did not. Borders bleed, but stories endure. Thrones crumble. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been dissolved. Karl was now a king without a kingdom. But Zita refused to accept their fall as permanent, and while diplomats signed treaties and generals retired into obscurity, she plotted in silence. She still had supporters: monarchists, loyalists, clergy who whispered her name in Latin prayers. And most importantly, she still had a claim. While the world was trying to forget the old monarchies, Zita and Karl launched a covert attempt to reclaim the throne of Hungary. It was bold, reckless, romantic, but it failed. In 1921, they made their first move. The Hungarian regent, Admiral Herthy, rejected their bid. The people, exhausted from war and revolution, didn't rise. The army stayed silent. But she didn't weep. She didn't shatter. She didn't become a historical footnote. And Zita, 7 months pregnant, was forced to flee again. This time, for good. She became something far more haunting, a ghost of an empire that refused to die. In 1922, he died in her arms. Now Zita was a widow, a mother of 8, and still an empress in her mind, not of a nation, but of a purpose. She wore black from that day forward, not out of grief alone, but as a uniform, a symbol, a reminder to the world. The monarchy wasn't over. It was waiting. They saw mourning veils, not sharp minds. People underestimated widows. She sent him to study at Louvain, then Sorbonne, then Fordham. She made sure he was educated, polished, fluent in 6 languages, just like her. Every handshake he made, every diplomat he met, every article he published was planned. She raised emperors, because Zita didn't raise sons. In the 1930s, as Hitler's shadow grew longer, Zita and her family found themselves hunted again. The Habsburg name still terrified totalitarians. Austria had banned their return. Germany labeled them enemies. Italy eyed them with suspicion. In 1940, the Nazis invaded France. Zita and her children barely escaped. Their train was bombed, their luggage abandoned, and in the chaos, Zita, the former Empress of Austria, walked for miles in the French countryside, guiding her children through woods and farmland with nothing but grit. Yes, America. Eventually, they reached Spain, then Portugal, then America. And in New York, something strange happened. Zita became anonymous. No processions, no crowns, no portraits in newspapers. She stood in lines, cooked her own food, rode in cars instead of carriages. And yet, she never stopped being royalty. Because royalty, to her, was not ceremony. She gave lectures, met with monarchist exiles, raised funds for Austrian refugees. She never begged. She organized. She strategized. She built networks. It was survival. And all the while, her son Otto, with her coaching, became one of the most influential anti-Nazi voices in Europe. And behind him always was Zita. While Roosevelt and Churchill debated alliances, Otto lobbied. He pushed for Austria's independence, for peace that did not ignore monarchy, for a Europe that still had space for the past, as long as it served the future. She never sought headlines. She built legacies. When World War II ended, Austria was free again, but not for her. The Republic still banned the Habsburgs from returning unless they renounced their claim to the throne. Otto eventually complied, but Zita, she refused. She had spent her life watching men make promises and break them. She had seen peace treaties collapse, monarchies vanish. She had watched the world rise and fall again. But one thing she never did was bend. And so she stayed in exile. Not to power, not to politics, not to public opinion. Until finally, in 1982, the Austrian government relented. For 50 years, she was 90 years old. And she returned to Vienna, not as a queen, not as a threat. Crowds lined the streets, because somehow she had outlived them all, the emperors, the generals, the dictators, even the nations. Old men wept. Young women stared. She had ruled from shadows, yes, but her shadow had shaped history. Zita of Bourbon-Parma never reigned in the traditional sense, but she endured. Through exile, through loss, through revolution, through silence. She had never needed a throne. She had become one. They didn't expect her to return. Not after 50 years, not after 8 children, not after losing a husband, a kingdom, and a century. But she did. She stepped off the plane, thin, veiled, dressed entirely in black. In the spring of 1982, the city of Vienna braced itself. The streets were cleaned. Old royalists dusted off their medals. Journalists sharpened their questions. And onlookers, most too young to remember her rule, leaned over balconies to catch a glimpse of the woman the world had almost forgotten. Zita of Bourbon-Parma had come home, as a shadow finally stepping into the light. Her arrival was quiet. No parades, no trumpets. But those who knew, those who remembered, they watched with haunted eyes. Because Zita wasn't set just a royal relic. She was a reminder of a world that had burned, of a woman who had waited. For decades, the Austrian Republic had banned her, fearing she would ignite old flames. But time had done what politics couldn't. It had blurred the edges of revolution. The monarchy no longer threatened. It lingered like a dream, mourned by some, mocked by others, but remembered by all. And in that dream, Zita had become a symbol, not of power. She visited monasteries, laid wreaths on old graves, whispered prayers in forgotten chapels. The newspapers called it a tour of nostalgia, but they missed the point. She wasn't set there to relive. She was there to reclaim, not the throne, but her narrative. But Zita had never been passive. She had been precise. Every silence she held, every exile she endured, it was a choice, a weapon, a statement. She had learned early on that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it watches, waits, records, until the world is finally quiet enough to listen. And now, they were listening. In private gatherings, Zita spoke about the collapse of empires, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke of alliances made and broken, of monarchs who had clung too tightly, of nations that had traded crowns for flags and found neither peace nor pride. She didn't preach. She observed, and in her presence, others questioned everything they thought they knew about strength. Because Zita wasn't strong in the way kings were. She was strong in the way cathedrals are, unmoved, patient, eternal. And slowly the world began to reshape its memory of her. She was no longer just the last empress. She became something bigger, a woman who had outlived her own myth. Young scholars began to study her life. Monarchist groups in Europe invoked her legacy. Even in America, where she had once stood anonymously in breadlines, universities now invited her name into their libraries. And still, she remained elusive. She never gave interviews, never dictated memoirs. She let others chase her story, and in doing so she kept control. Visibility is not always freedom. Sometimes invisibility is power. In her final years, she split her time between Switzerland and Austria. Her health faded, but her will never did. She wrote letters, encouraged monarchist causes, corrected historical errors with the flick of a pen, and through it all she remained Zita, unapologetically herself, unbroken, unburied. Zita didn't just survive history, she seeded it. And in the quiet halls of politics, her influence whispered, not with crowns, with conviction. On March 14, 1989, Zita passed away. She was 96, but she didn't vanish. Because legends don't die. They change form. Austria gave her a state funeral, an honor denied to her in exile. Tens of thousands attended. Black banners lined the Hofburg Palace. Bells rang out across Vienna. And as her procession moved through the streets, silence fell. Not the silence of mourning, the silence of recognition. They weren't just burying a woman. And in that moment, as snow fell gently on the black horses pulling her hearse, something ancient stirred. The old ghosts, the broken crowns. To remember that empires rise and fall, but people endure. That women who vanish are always lost. And now her story belonged to the world, not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint for resistance, for patience, for grace under siege. She was the first monarch of memory, of myth, of meaning, but only because that sits where light is clearest. And for every girl who's been told to sit quietly, for every woman who's watched history pass her by, for every soul who sits wondered if silence has power, Zita answers, yes, but only if you choose it. They thought it would end with her, the black veil, the funeral procession, the ringing bells. Zita's burial in Vienna was meant to be closure, a soft, ceremonial exhale. But it wasn't an ending. It was a passing of the torch. Because what they didn't realize, what they never saw, was that Zita had been planting something in the dark. Not rebellion, not restoration, but memory, weaponized memory. And her children were the keepers of it, especially Otto. Otto von Habsburg was not just her eldest son. He was her echo, the one she whispered history into when the world had gone blind. He had watched the empire collapse before his 10th birthday, had tasted exile before he could understand betrayal. While other boys were learning to ride horses, Otto was learning how to stay alive without a throne. And Zita, stoic, mourning, careful, had taught him everything. How to navigate salons where every conversation was a test. How to respond to rumors with silence sharp enough to cut. How to carry a crown without ever putting it on. By the time he was 20, Otto could speak 7 languages. By 30, he was negotiating with dictators and presidents, not as a royal, not even as a politician, as a survivor. Zita had taught her son that survival is strategy. And Otto, he became the quiet weapon of a lost empire. When Austria debated whether to allow the Habsburgs back, Otto refused to renounce his claim to the throne. It wasn't about power, it was about truth. You can exile a crown, he once wrote, but you cannot exile what it stood for. That line, pure Zita. And behind every one of his speeches was her voice. Zita had raised her children not to mourn the past, but to carry it, not as nostalgia. In quiet rooms, she told them about the night Franz Joseph died, about the sound of boots on palace floors, about the day they had to leave everything behind with only what they could carry. But she never told these stories with tears. She told them like blueprints, lessons wrapped in lace. And forgetting is how empires die. But her children would not forget. Karl Ludwig became a Jesuit, Felix a businessman, Rudolf an academic, Robert a diplomat. Each carried her lessons into different corners of the globe. But Otto, he walked straight back into the fire. When World War II broke out, the Nazis branded him a traitor. Hitler himself had marked him for death. Zita and her children fled to America. Another exile, another beginning. She was nearly 60 then, but exile didn't soften her, it sharpened her. In New York, she lived modestly, no entourage, no title, but she hosted salons in cramped apartments. She strategized with exiled European leaders. She studied Roosevelt's speeches. And Otto, he traveled across continents, warning leaders about Hitler long before the bombs fell. The Habsburgs, exiled, erased, unwanted, became moral witnesses. When the old world dies, the survivors aren't useless. They're still necessary. Otto's speeches about European unity weren't sentimental. They were surgical. He seen borders tear families apart, watched nationalism mutate into genocide. And through it all, Zita had been there, calm, composed, with a spine made of iron. He once told a journalist, "My mother taught me that silence can be a speech, but sometimes the world needs to hear the voice that has been hiding too long." That was her war strategy. Zita had never thrown a revolution, never led a charge. She raised diplomats like other mothers raise soldiers. She taught loyalty not to a flag, but to an idea. The idea that memory is resistance, that silence can outlive noise, that even an empire in ashes can cast a long shadow. When Otto eventually renounced his claim to the throne for the sake of Austria's peace, Zita didn't protest. She nodded once, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Not because she had given up, because she knew the crown was never the point. The fight wasn't set for a throne, it was for truth. And truth, Zita knew, survives best in exile. As Otto rose in European politics, he was often mocked for his heritage. A monarchist playing modern, others sneered. But they never saw the discipline underneath. The mother who had taught him to hold his tongue, to wait for the right moment, to strike with dignity. Zita didn't need her sons to restore the monarchy. She needed them to restore the idea that nobility wasn't dead, that it could evolve, that it could survive bombs, borders, and betrayal. And Otto did just that. Because Zita had raised him not in bitterness, but in belief. Belief that the past is not a prison. It sips a mirror. And if you stare into it long enough, you shall see not just what was lost. In the end, Otto lived longer than any emperor of Austria. He died in 2011, nearly a century after his birth. At his funeral, thousands gathered in Vienna. Old monarchist songs were sung quietly in the crowd, and among the mourners, one question floated unspoken. Was it over now? Was the Habsburg legacy finally extinguished? But history doesn't work like that. Because Zita Sip's legacy wasn't sit in Otto Sip's funeral. It was in every scholar who revisited her letters. Every girl who read about a queen who didn't scream, but outlasted. The Empress had ruled from the shadows, and her son had ruled with her light. Together, they proved something the world still struggles to believe. That dignity can survive exile. That silence can move nations. That power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a veil, and waits, and watches, and wins. They thought history would forget her, and for a while, it almost did. The textbooks skipped over her name. The documentaries called her the Widow Empress and moved on. Even the museums barely mentioned her, just a small portrait in a dim hallway. No fanfare, no scandal, no story. Because Zita didn't leave behind legends, she left behind paper, letters, diaries, margins scribbled with warnings, and for decades they sat in silence until someone finally started to read. And what they found was a war story, but not the kind with guns. A war fought in whispers, in alliances, in erased records. A battle for control, not of land, but of truth. Zita had known all along that history isn't written by the victors, it's rewritten by the survivors. After Otto's rise in politics, something unexpected began to happen. Researchers began requesting access to the Habsburg archives. Royal historians who had once dismissed Zita as a footnote started to wonder, how did she survive so many regimes? Why was she consulted by resistance networks in exile? Why had so many royal families, even those who hated Austria, respected her judgment? The answers weren't in the headlines. They were hidden in fragments. A coded message smuggled during World War II, a refusal to accept Nazi citizenship, a series of letters warning her sons never to trust certain diplomats. Zita had never stopped fighting. Even in exile, she had built networks, from Catholic monarchists to underground resistance cells. Her salons weren't tea parties. They were strategy meetings. And her memory, it wasn't set accidental. It was curated. Each time she allowed herself to be photographed, it was deliberate. The black veil, the quiet eyes, the posture of mourning, not weakness, dignity, controlled grief. She understood what power looked like, and she used it even when they thought she had none. But time is cruel. And after Otto's death in 2011, something shifted again. Modern Austria didn't want to talk about monarchy, and the European Union, the very vision Otto had fought for, had no place for royal ghosts. Until 2017, a letter surfaced, forgotten in a family vault, dated in her own hand, with a faded Habsburg seal. Inside, a manifesto, not of vengeance, of vision. She had written, "The crown is not a jewel. It is a mirror. May those who wear it see themselves clearly, or may they be blinded by the truth." Not the romantic widow, not the tragic empress, but the architect of something invisible. And suddenly, Zita was back. Not in headlines, in code. Young historians started calling her the ghost of Europe, the one who haunted the corridors of diplomacy, the woman whose letters still read like war briefings. And as the digital world rediscovered her, something else happened. A question began to rise. What if the war never ended? Not the one with soldiers. The one between women and the empires that tried to silence them. Because Zita's story wasn't just about Austria. It was about endurance. She had lived through monarchy, world wars, exile, fascism, betrayal, and loss, and yet she never surrendered her voice. Not once. Even when no one listened, she kept writing. Even when no one asked, she kept remembering. She had a truth that didn't need applause. Because loud rebels are easy to kill. They become legends. In 2021, a university in France held a symposium on women in political exile. The opening keynote, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, Sovereignty Without a Throne. In that room, she was no longer forgotten. But not everyone was pleased. Royal traditionalists accused historians of exaggerating her role. She was just a mother, they said. She mourned, she didn't set lead. But that was the point. Zita had led without shouting, mourned without breaking, mothered without erasing herself. She had weaponized patience, outlasted regimes not by fighting them, but by making herself too quiet to kill and too sharp to ignore. Her faith, ridiculed by some, had also been her armor. Catholicism wasn't a ritual for her. It was resistance, the kind of moral framework that reminded her, even in exile, you are still sovereign over your mind, your silence and your soul. And in a world that tried to make her choose between womanhood and royalty, she chose both, on her terms. As new generations of women studied diplomacy, monarchy and exile, Zita's name now appears more often, not as a figure of nostalgia, as a blueprint. The blueprint for surviving systems built to forget you, not by breaking them, but by watching them fall apart while you stand still. And still, somehow, she remains misunderstood. Even now, if you Google her, most images are of her in mourning. Widow sits veil, tight lips, pale skin. But that was just her disguise. Her war paint. Underneath, she was planning. When the Austrians debated repatriating her remains, to honor her legacy, some questioned if she would have wanted that. After all, they'd exiled her in the first place. She had died in Switzerland, far from the palaces that once adored her. They needed her memory. But she no longer needed their approval, because Zita had never fought for a crown. She had fought to be remembered correctly, not as a victim, not as a ghost, as a force. And when her great-granddaughter was asked what Zita would have thought of being remembered this way, she smiled and said she would have said nothing, just offered tea, then listened to everything you didn't say. That was Zita, the Empress in exile, the strategist in black, the mother of memory, the woman who ruled without a kingdom and taught us that sometimes the greatest power is to watch history bend around your silence. And she sits still here, in the margins of textbooks, in the pauses between political speeches, in the quiet strength of those who endure, not to be seen, but to outlast. Zita never wore the crown again, but she never took it off either, because royalty isn't set gold. Sometimes it's sent grit. In the final years of her life, Zita no longer traveled by train or carriage. The world had shrunk, but her silence had expanded. She moved between borrowed homes and dimly lit chapels, always wrapped in black, as if mourning not just her husband, but an entire empire. But the truth, she had never mourned the empire. Not really. What she grieved was the lie, the illusion that a crown could ever protect its people. She'd seen it crack. She'd watched men in velvet robes shake hands with monsters. She'd watched monarchies bow not to God or duty, but to fear. And she never forgot. She never stopped naming them, not because she believed in vengeance, but because she believed in memory as justice. There was a drawer in her final home in Zeisers, Switzerland. Inside were letters from all over the world, diplomats, refugees, scholars, women with no title at all writing to thank her, to ask advice, to confess secrets. They believed she would listen, because Zita didn't just survive history, she absorbed it. She had become a vessel for the stories too dangerous to speak aloud, an archive in human form. And even as her voice grew frail, her eyes remained sharp. Her presence was unnerving, not because she commanded obedience, but because she expected honesty. Even the Vatican sent envoys in secret. They never announced their visits. They arrived without press, without robes. Zita would receive them in a plain room, offer weak tea and sharper questions. She asked about South America, about Poland, about rising fascist parties in France. She never retired. Because Zita knew, when people stop writing, they start forgetting, and forgetting is how the powerful rewrite truth. But her greatest legacy wasn't written in ink. It was in the quiet revolution she sparked without anyone noticing. In the 1980s, a group of young women studying international law at Oxford requested to interview her. They expected to find a relic, a ceremonial figurehead. What they found instead was a strategist. Zita didn't talk about royalty. She talked about constitutional loopholes, the dangers of soft fascism, the weaponization of nostalgia. She warned them that the world would always disguise tyranny in polite language, and that law without memory was just a mask. She ended the interview with a sentence that would haunt them for decades. The crown is no longer worn, but the crown still speaks. You must listen for it, in silence. They didn't understand it then, but later, as Europe faced new waves of nationalism, as democracies faltered and borders hardened, her words returned like prophecy. Because Zita's war had never ended, it had just changed costume. She had fought fascism long before it had a name. She had resisted collaboration, even when her children starved. She had said no when the world demanded yes, and that made her dangerous. Even now, governments hesitate to study her closely. Because Zita wasn't just an empress. She was a mirror, and most regimes fear mirrors. They fear what she reveals. That power does not require thrones. That sovereignty can exist in silence. That a woman with no army can still reshape the memory of a continent. In 1982, when her health began to decline, Otto begged her to move closer to family. She refused. "I said move too much already," she said. "Let them come to me if they dare." When she died, the world expected a quiet funeral. What they got was an echo. Thousands gathered, in Austria, in Hungary, in Switzerland, not just monarchists, students, exiles, women in black scarves, survivors of wars she had lived through, all whispering the same thing. She never stopped watching. And perhaps that was her final gift. She reminded us that endurance is a form of protest, that waiting, not with passivity, but with purpose, is its own rebellion. Because while empires collapse in noise, resistance grows in quiet. Zita had waited a lifetime, and in that waiting, she built something stronger than armies. She built remembrance. She built a generation of watchers, and now those watchers were everywhere. Some worked in courtrooms, some taught in universities, some wore veils, some carried protest signs, some sat in the back of the room, unnoticed, until it was too late. They had all learned from her, not through lectures, but through example. And slowly, carefully, the world was beginning to understand. In 2022, a small exhibit was quietly added to a museum in Vienna. No grand unveiling, no ribbon cutting, just a glass case in a corner room. Inside, her veil, a page from her diary, a photograph of her holding Otto Sip's hand in exile, and a plaque with a single quote. "What they call obedience, I called patience. What they call weakness was the strength not to shout." Visitors stood still in front of it. Some cried, not because they knew her story, but because they recognized her silence. It was the same silence many carried inside themselves. The silence of not being believed, of being erased. Zita Sepp's life wasn't a legend. It was a reminder that history isn't only made by those who conquer. It's also made by those who endure long enough to be remembered on their own terms. Not as a relic, not as a romantic shadow, as a sovereign woman, without throne, without army, without apology. The empress who outlived her empire, and who, even now, refuses to fade. They buried her with no crown, no gold, no jewels, no velvet, just a simple black dress, her wedding ring, and a folded letter placed near her heart, its contents known only to her children. The woman who had once been the Empress of Austria-Hungary was lowered into the earth without a single emblem of power. But the silence spoke louder than 1,000 trumpets. Zita had always said that power without principle was an illusion, and in death, as in life, she refused illusions. The world watched as her casket was carried across the borders she had once fled, from Switzerland to Austria, through towns she had never revisited, but had never left her memory. No royal parade, no forced displays, just crowds of strangers who came to pay their respects to a woman most had never truly seen, but somehow felt they had known all along. Because Zita wasn't a ruler they had studied in textbooks. The whisper behind their grandmother Sip's grief. The silhouette behind every photo taken before the war tore their homes apart. And as the funeral bells rang across Vienna, people didn't just mourn a monarch, they mourned a chapter of history that had never been allowed to finish. Inside the church, where sunlight cut through stained glass like judgment, Otto stood before the coffin, not as a prince, but as a son who had inherited his mother's silence. He had spent his entire life carrying the burden of the Habsburg name, fighting for recognition, seeking justice, trying to restore a monarchy the world no longer wanted. But now, looking down at the woman who had taught him everything, he finally understood. Zita hadn't spent her life waiting for a crown to be restored. She had spent it proving that you don't need a throne to lead. Otto's eulogy was brief. Too brief, some said. But those who had truly known Zita recognized the message between the words. She never gave up, he said. But she never gave in either. And that was enough. Because Zita's strength had never been in her proclamations, it was in her refusal. Her refusal to bend. Her refusal to be rewritten. And in that refusal, she became something more powerful than an empress. She became a myth with teeth. In the years that followed her burial, something strange began to happen. Not immediately, not with fanfare, but gradually, like the slow turning of a tide. Her story resurfaced. First in whispers, then in documentaries, then in textbooks that had once erased her name entirely. Historians who had dismissed her as a conservative relic began to see her as something more complex, a strategist, a survivor, a revolutionary cloaked in obedience. Because what Zita had done, what no one had expected, was weaponized tradition against itself. She had learned the rules, perfected them, and then bent them silently until they cracked. She had been raised to be the perfect empress, obedient, devout, supportive, and she had used those expectations as cover, to spy, to influence, to resist. And by the time they realized what she had done, it was too late. Zita had rewritten what it meant to survive an empire, not with armies, not with manifestos, but with endurance so profound it became a form of defiance. In 2009, nearly 2 decades after her death, something even more unexpected happened. The Catholic Church began proceedings to declare her a saint. It stunned everyone, because sainthood was not reserved for queens, especially not for queens who had moved through the shadows. But the movement wasn't driven by royalty. It was driven by ordinary people, survivors of war, refugees, mothers, scholars, all of whom had seen themselves reflected in her long, silent battle. To them, Zita wasn't just a woman of faith. She was faith, tested by fire. And for the first time, the Church, the same institution that had once demanded her submission, began to see her as a model of resistance. Not rebellion, but holy resistance. Measured, patient, relentless. In their petition, they wrote, "She taught us how to serve without surrendering, how to suffer without bitterness, and how to love a broken world without losing hope." But Zita's canonization wasn't what made her immortal. What made her immortal was what she left behind. Not palaces, but people. People who had been changed simply by knowing she existed. There was the nun in Paraguay who taught her students that silence could be sacred. The refugee girl in Canada who said Zita's story taught her she didn't have to explain her pain. The historian in Belgium who admitted that every time he wrote about war, he now asked himself, would Zita have believed this version? These were her legacy, not bloodlines, but echoes. Because Zita's war had never really been about politics. It was about memory, and memory, once awakened, cannot be silenced again. In the final scene of the documentary film made about her, the camera lingers on the veil she wore for nearly 60 years, the one she refused to take off after Karl's death. The narrator whispers, "Some women remove the veil and enter the world." Zita wore the veil and watched the world reveal itself. And maybe that was the point all along. She didn't rule from the shadows because she was afraid. She ruled from the shadows because that's where the truth lived. They called it closure. But closure is a lie. The living tell themselves to feel better about the dead. Because for Zita, nothing had ever really closed. Not the wounds, not the wars, and certainly not the silence. But the truth? She had been the last breath of an empire, and the first whisper of a new kind of resistance. It wasn't in the grand libraries or political archives where her real legacy survived. It was in the unspoken, in the way her great-granddaughters carried themselves at international events. In the secret letters kept in the family vault, letters never published, never translated. In the haunted glances between those who knew what the royal history books refused to print. Because there were things about Zita no one dared say out loud. That her devotion wasn't submission, it was strategy. That her silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. That her exile wasn't just a fall, it was a choice to watch the world burn from a distance. In the final years of her life, Zita had begun writing a private chronicle, not a diary, a reckoning, one that began not with her childhood, but with a question: what survives when the crown is gone? She never finished the manuscript. Or maybe she did, and hid the last pages. Her children never released it. Her grandchildren never acknowledged it. Because Zita had foreseen the fall of more than just her monarchy, she saw what would become of all monarchies, how they would transform into pageantry, stripped of power but still chained by performance. She wrote of the myth of neutrality, how royal figures in the modern world pretend to be apolitical while their every photo, every silence, every appearance carries the weight of centuries of oppression or survival. She warned that if royalty became entertainment, then the people would become spectators, and history would become theater. And perhaps that's why they buried her so quietly. Because Zita didn't fit into the neat narratives of royal redemption. She wasn't set the tragic beauty. She was a woman who knew too much, and said just enough to unsettle. In 2020, an independent historian, a woman from Prague whose grandmother had once served in Zita's household, published a book titled The Empress's Ghost. It was quickly pulled from shelves. Not banned, not censored, just erased. Quietly. But in those few weeks, those who read it found something that made them shiver. The historian claimed that Zita had kept extensive intelligence records during her exile, names of collaborators, notes on Vatican diplomacy, private correspondences with French, Belgian, and even Soviet contacts. Not to stage a coup, not to return to power, but to ensure that truth, even if buried, would not stay buried forever. She had known she wouldn't live to see Europe reckon with its ghosts. But she had planted seeds, and now they were sprouting in places no one could control. There were signs, small ones. A plaque unveiled in a ruined village where she once fed starving children, installed not by a government but by descendants of peasants. A university course in Germany where her letters were studied not as royal literature but as political strategy. A quiet movement in Austria where women who had been erased from textbooks were being re-added, Zita among them, not as an empress, but as a shadow diplomat. It was as though the world had finally started to understand. She had ruled with memory, and memory, once unlocked, is more dangerous than any sword. There's a famous photograph, rarely circulated, taken just before her death. She's seated in a modest chair, no royal robes, no family by her side. Just her hands folded on her lap, her eyes sharp, scanning the camera as if she's reading the person behind it. Most people see an old woman, frail, tired, but look closely. She sits not fading, and perhaps that's the real legacy she left behind. Not power, not victory, but vigilance. She taught the world how to pay attention, to what is instead said, to who gets erased, to where the truth is buried. And now, in a world flooded with noise, with documentaries, with exposés, with royal scandals splashed across screens, Zita's silence speaks louder than ever. Because she knew something the world is only beginning to understand. That real power isn't set about who wears the crown. It's about who controls the story. Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Empress of Austria-Hungary, was no longer a person in the eyes of the world. She was a relic, a footnote, a name attached to a crumbling dynasty, and that was the safest way to remember her, as someone already gone. But Zita never truly left. Not from history, not from memory, not even from the institutions that had tried so hard to forget her, because the moment they buried her was also the moment the questions began. Whispers in the Vatican, unmarked envelopes sent to European libraries, archival materials suddenly marked restricted. Why? Because Zita hadn't just outlived her empire. She had outthought it. She knew how legacies were shaped, not by facts, but by stories. And she made sure that when her enemies came looking for a clean version of her past, they would find dust, contradictions, and locked drawers. But not silence. She had never been silent. While the world branded her a symbol of mourning, she had been building something underground, a network of truths too dangerous to say out loud. And she hid them not in vaults, but in gestures, in letters disguised as prayers, in conversations behind cathedral walls, in faces of women who owed nothing to thrones, but everything to memory. Power doesn't vanish when it steps stripped away. It changes shape. And in her final decades, she became something far more dangerous than a dethroned monarch. She became an idea of what it meant to survive without surrender, of what it meant to live not for image, but for principle. Because Zita had watched too many of her contemporaries sell their dignity for nostalgia. She saw other exiled royals cozy up to fascists, trade honors for visibility, rewrite their sins as patriotism. She could have done the same. She had the pedigree, the lineage, the quiet support of Catholic monarchists who would have given anything to make her their icon. But Zita refused. She refused every public interview, every offer to correct the record, every invitation to step back into the spotlight. Because she knew something they didn't set. The world doesn't remember you for how loudly you speak. It remembers you for what it can explain. And Zita couldn't be explained. She didn't die a martyr. She didn't die a villain. She didn't even die famous. She died unread, and that terrified them, refusing to be wrapped up in a neat ending. The young scholars who dared to study her found themselves haunted by inconsistencies, annotations with no sources, letters where dates were scratched out, rumors of secret correspondence with resistance movements in Belgium, France, and even within Austria itself, movements that didn't ask for her blessing, but received it anyway, quietly, without a signature. It was as if she was building something, or protecting something, or preparing for something no one else had the vision to see. And maybe that's why her name still stings in certain corners of Europe. She didn't go mad. She didn't drink herself to sleep. She didn't remarry or turn bitter or live through tabloids. She studied. She watched. She listened. And above all, she remembered. Even when the world didn't remember her. When her children tried to publish memoirs, she edited them in red ink, slashing through any paragraph that sounded too noble. Tell it straight, she wrote. Not clean, not heroic, just honest. Because saints are safe. But Zita was not safe. She was the last witness to an empire's death, and the only one who didn't ask to bring it back. In her later years, she took long walks at dawn. Observers noted she'd stop by windows of schools, watching children run. Not her own, never her own. Her family was scattered, loyal, yes, but burdened by her weight. She never let herself become their tragedy. She carried her exile like armor, never removing it, not even when the weather warmed. And when she was asked, once, by a young journalist what she missed most about her life before the fall, she said simply, not being seen. That's when they realized Zita hadn't lost her throne. She had escaped it. And that escape, not the exile, not the war, not the funeral, was her final act of defiance. She left no autobiography, no palace tour, no Netflix series. An unfinished sentence. One that forces us to ask, what happens when the last royal doesn't want to be remembered? Not to be pitied, not even to be known, just left alone. And maybe that sip's the loudest thing she ever said. Because in a world obsessed with branding women as queens, victims, icons, scandals, Zita rejected every label. She didn't wield her suffering like a weapon. She didn't allow her silence to be misread as shame. She was precise, deliberate. Even in stillness, she moved history. It wasn't even winnable. It was silent and personal. A war against disappearance. And in that silence, she carved her place in the one place empires can suck control. Memory. They thought the story was over. But if you stood in the back, near the stone columns, you might have noticed something strange. Not grief, not reverence. Something closer to confusion. She had been a monarch without a kingdom, a widow who refused to play the part, a devout Catholic who questioned God in silence, a mother who let her children grow beyond her, a queen who never begged for legacy but left behind one anyway. And that was the wound they couldn't name. Zita didn't die as a symbol. She died as a riddle. Her life hadn't followed the narrative they needed. She hadn't broken publicly. She hadn't glorified the monarchy. She hadn't raged or begged or vanished in luxury. She endured, silently, rigorously, with the same sharpness she used to correct her own biographers. And so they buried her with fanfare, but not closure. Because Zita left them no instructions for how to remember her, she never asked to be remembered. And yet, we do. Not because she held power, but because she held herself, even as everything around her collapsed. Because when the palaces fell, and the armies surrendered, and the newspapers stopped printing her name, Zita kept waking up, kept walking, kept praying, kept knowing the difference between duty and delusion. She had once been crowned Empress of Austria-Hungary, consort to an empire stretching across 11 nations. By the end, she lived alone in a borrowed room, surrounded by books, letters, and the names of children she had taught to guard the truth with silence. And that silence, that was her rebellion. Zita was never just surviving. She was practicing a form of resistance too quiet for most to notice. When they told her the empire was dead, she said nothing. When they invited her back for commemorations, she declined. When her story was rewritten, she did not correct it. She simply endured. And that's what made her dangerous. Because for women like Zita, endurance is not weakness, it is strategy. She had watched the old world burn twice, watched sons go to war for flags stitched by ghosts, watched women be praised for their beauty and punished for their grief, watched truth become propaganda, watched names like hers turn into symbols for things she never believed in. And so she let them erase her, on purpose. Not because she was defeated, but because she refused to perform for them again. That her silence speak louder than their noise. And maybe it did. Because here we are, still trying to understand her. Still reaching into the shadows she left behind. Still whispering her name like a spell. Not to summon power, but to remember something we forgot. That not every queen is a crown. Not every woman who rules needs a throne. And not every legacy is meant to be loud. Not with soldiers or speeches, but with survival, with dignity, with an unshakable refusal to let others define her. And maybe that's why she matters now more than ever. Because today's world is louder than ever. And in the noise, it's easy to mistake visibility for truth. But Zita reminds us, disappearance can be power. Silence can be sacred. She lived through more than most of us can imagine. She lost more than most of us will ever know. But she never surrendered herself. And that in the end is what turned her from a historical figure into a symbol of something deeper. Not royalty, but resilience. Not tradition, but transformation. Zita of Bourbon-Parma did not leave behind an empire. She left behind a blueprint. For women forced to perform. For survivors made to smile. For anyone who's ever been told to be grateful while grieving. Zita reminds us, you can lose the world and still keep yourself. You can vanish from the records and still matter more than the ones they wrote about. You can live your truth so quietly that it outlasts every lie they ever printed. And so, if her story moved you, if something about her quiet fury stirred something in your chest, don't let it fade. Let it shape you. Let it remind you that you are not defined by what you lost, or what they say. You are defined by what you protect, by what you choose, by the pieces of yourself you refuse to let them take. Zita made her final statement without a crown, without a microphone, without an army. She made it by refusing to be erased. And now, she lives again. Not in palaces, but in you. If this story meant something to you, if you saw a piece of yourself in the woman they tried to forget, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, stories that were almost erased but refused to disappear. What would you choose to protect, even if the world demanded you give it away? Because sometimes, the quietest voices leave the deepest echoes. And Zita was never silent. She was waiting to be heard.